This is Troutbitten Tips. Thanks for joining me. So I hear a lot of confusion about one of the most important things in fly fishing for trout. It's the dead drift. And a lot of times we think we have it, but we don't. The goal for a dry fly and for a nymph is a dead drift. But what is it? A good dead drift is a one-seam drift that travels the current speed without influence from the attached tippet. But that's hard to do. So let's talk about the difference between a drift and a dead drift, and then go over some of the most important things for getting a great dead drift on top and underneath. So we do spend a lot of time trying to get a dead drift, and I've written about it a lot on the Troutbitten website. In its purest form, a dead drift is just a fly that is drifting naturally with the current. One seam. It's going current speed without influence from the attached tippet. But to do that with a dry fly up top and to do that with a nymph underneath requires that we really do two opposite things with that tippet. So let's talk about it. Let's start with dry flies. All right, so let's start with the easy one. Let's start with dry flies. Up top, we can see the dry fly, so we can see success. We can see if it's dead drifting with the currents here, or if it's sliding, if it's skating, even if it's just traveling a little bit too fast, if it's going slower or faster than the bubbles, if it's going across seams a little bit and not tracking with the bubbles on the surface, well then it's not a dead drift. And you know, you don't even need the bubbles there to be able to see this current speed. We can read that current speed even without bubbles. And if it's moving unnaturally at all, then it's not a dead drift. You could say it's drifting downstream, but it's not truly a dead drift. And what happens here is as soon as I see that, well, as soon as the fly gains the tension, really, with the tippet, as soon as the tippet straightens out, it influences that dry fly. So to achieve this dead drift, we have to place slack on the water so that there is no tension to that dry fly. So we're actually placing S-curves and slack on the water, and then we might even do mends and whatnot to keep the tension off of that dry. That's the thing, put slack on the water to give that fly some grace to drift on the surface, unaltered by the attached tippet. That's a good dead drift, when it's traveling naturally down one seam at the current speed. That's what we're looking for. That's a good dead drift. So getting dead drifts on a nymph is really the hard thing. It's more difficult than getting dead drifts on a dry because we can't see these nymphs once they go under the water. So you can't necessarily see success. Well, not as easily. We can learn to read our sighter, learn to read our indicator, but when the fly disappears under the surface, things get a lot more complicated. Think about it. There's three-dimensional currents under there. No longer are we just dealing with the surface current, but now all the currents underneath. So no longer can we put slack in the system to get a dead drift to these nymphs. When we go under the water, we can't put S-curves under there. We don't want slack because all those extra currents we're talking about will pull the slack this way and that way and just create drag. Extra slack under the water really creates drag, and especially the faster currents you fish, the more that's true. So instead of putting slack in the system when we nymph, to get this dead drift, we need to be tight to we really want to be tight to the nymph. We want to be slicing through the water with tippet that is tight or close to it. This applies whether you're tight line nymphing or if you have an indicator up top. If I have an indie up top, I still want my indie to be in touch with the nymph below, or again, just barely. That's the key, is slicing through with a tight line. And we need that in one seam. So with that contact, with a tight line to the nymph, is a dead drift ever really possible? That's a fair question, because if we're in touch with the nymph, how can it drift naturally? It can, you can do it. The first key is to keep everything in one seam. The nymph is in one seam, and that attached tippet needs to be in one seam, or else the currents are going to cut through and drag it off course. And when we talk about being tight to the nymph, really the key is to slip in and out of contact a lot of times. We want to be in touch, but not too much. Influence the fly a bit, and then back off and let it do its own thing. So I know we'll get some questions about, what's this dead drift really look like underneath? That's a tough question to answer, because there are so many variables, even just right here. In this small piece of water, I get this inside seam, the main seam, the far seam, okay, and a lot of stuff in between. The other thing here is too, do I want to get a dead drift that is going in the middle of the column? Do I think that trout coming up and eating my tag fly up above? Do I find that they're eating on the drop? What kind of dead drift do I want? We'll address that sometime too. There are a lot of different ways to get a dead drift underneath. I'd say my most common is I like the flies to be, my point fly, to be down in that strike zone. So I'll try to do it right here. I'm gonna get the fly down in. Even without touching the bottom, I know I'm down in because my sighter is going slower than the top current. I'm using the top current, those bubbles right there, I'm slower, as a reference. I'm using it as a reference. And when I see the sighter slow down, I know I'm down in, right there. The nymphs are in a slower current seam, and it's probably that lowest seam, that strike zone. And so here, even without touching, I'm getting a good drift. It's a different drift. It's strike zone ride. It's this different drift than a bottom bouncing approach. Both dead drifts. There, that's nice. I'm going slower than the bubbles. Both dead drifts. And yeah, as I come down through here, I'm probably touching twice in this case. And once I find it, I don't even need to touch. If I come through the exact same lane, now I've really learned about it. There, I'm in. I'm going slower than the bubbles. I'm not even touching or tapping at all, but I'm getting nice strike zone rides. And then there's also another way to do this. You can still overweight the system. Put extra weight out there in some form, whether it's split shot or a drop shot or just a heavy tungsten beaded fly. You can overweight it and get your nymph down there where you really do have contact all the way through. I'm actually using a drop shot right here. So the shot is touching and the flies are just above. That's what I'm trying to do, is in this case get a dead drift that just tickles and touches that bottom, a slower ride, using the bottom to really slow me down. In this fast stuff, I often do this to really slow it down. And that's a good dead drift, because there are bugs down there in that really slow current that's way slower than the middle current. There are bugs down there drifting just like that. If you have the experience and a good eye for it and just a good feel, if you're good at controlling that contact and controlling the nymph all the way down, if you know what that dead drift really should look like and how it should travel downstream, you can do it. You can get a great dead drift. That's like doctorate level nymphing. But you get there, and maybe it takes a few seasons to do it. That's how we get dead drifts on a nymph. So a dead drift is a fly traveling in one seam, uninfluenced by that attached tippet. That's easy to understand, but it's hard to do. A fly crossing seams is not a dead drift. Now you can think of it as drifting. Sure, it's drifting downstream, but it's not a dead drift if it's crossing seams. So we get that dead drift up top by providing slack to the dry fly. And underneath, we do the opposite. We need to eliminate slack, slice through the current with contact to the nymph. But critically, that tippet needs to be in the same seam as the nymph. And we need to be in control of everything. But that's probably enough to chew on for now. So fish hard, friends, and have fun out there. Can you say action, please? Right. So I like this. That made a huge difference. I don't know what it is. I might have foul hooked something. It's good fish. That's what it is. Come on up, baby. You now.